When I first drove down the main road of Summerview Estates, the place looked like the pinnacle of suburban serenity. The tall, leafy trees swayed in the gentle breeze, and each yard boasted immaculate lawns with glimmering sprinklers arching water across the grass. Rows of pastel houses lined the cul-de-sacs, each with a tidy front porch and perfectly matching shutters. It felt like a postcard of the American dream. I was relocating for a fresh start, eager to embrace the relative calm of an HOA-regulated neighborhood. The real estate agent touted Summerview Estates as a harmoniously managed community with a robust homeowners association that took pride in beautifying shared areas. In theory, that sounded great. After years living in a rowdy apartment complex, the concept of well-maintained streets, enforced quiet hours, and a cohesive design aesthetic appealed to me. But as I soon discovered, Summerview Estates' outward serenity rested under the watchful eye of a single, formidable presence, Beatrice Arnett. She was known around the neighborhood by her not-so-secret nickname, Karen. Rumor had it that Karen was in her late 40s or early 50s, always impeccably dressed, hair never out of place, and possessed an uncanny ability to pop up whenever a resident violated even the most minor regulation. At the time, these stories seemed amusing. Little did I know how quickly I'd wind up in her crosshairs. On move-in day, Harriet from next door, an older woman with a warm smile, handed me cookies and, after friendly small talk, quietly warned me, "Watch out for Ms. Arnett on the HOA board. She's well-meaning in her mind, but can be a tyrant in practice." Naively, I assumed Harriet was exaggerating. Summerview Estates looked so pleasant that it was hard to imagine a neighborly dictatorship lurking beneath. All that changed the day Karen unveiled her grand project. Community-funded decorative stone benches that each homeowner would be forced to pay for, regardless of whether they wanted them or not. About a month after I settled in, the HOA announced an upcoming special meeting to discuss community enhancements. The notice left in each mailbox mentioned improvements to common areas, possible new landscaping around the pond, and a unifying decorative installation. Intrigued, I decided to attend, hoping it would be a routine discussion. That was my first direct encounter with Karen, and it set the tone for all that followed. The meeting took place in the Summerview Estates clubhouse. A small crowd of about 30 residents showed up, half curious, half wary. Up front sat the HOA board behind a rectangular table, for individuals, but overshadowed by the presence of Karen at the center. She wore a pale blue blazer, hair swept back in a tidy chignon, eyes scanning the room as if taking inventory of potential dissent. After some minor housekeeping, budget updates, minor rule clarifications about trash can placements, Karen cleared her throat and began, "It's my pleasure to introduce our new Summerview Enhancement Project. I believe it will elevate our neighborhood's aesthetic appeal, fostering elegance and unity." She gestured to a poster board that revealed a stylized sketch of large stone benches dotting the sidewalks near each house. They looked ornate, with carved legs and flourished designs on the backrests. Karen's voice exuded authority. "Each homeowner will have at least one bench in front of their property, giving Summerview Estates a cohesive and welcoming look. The cost will be a modest assessment of a few $100s per household, distributed across all residents to ensure fairness." She paused, letting it sink in. "We want Summerview to stand out as a refined community that invests in decorative consistency." I glanced around, sensing murmurs of confusion and doubt. Harriet, seated beside me, whispered that we never asked for benches. Another resident stood up, politely asking if the benches were optional. Karen gave a tight-lipped smile. "No, we need uniform participation for the design to work. The board has the power to impose special assessments for community improvements." This project was discussed at length in smaller committees. I felt an uneasy twist in my stomach. The benches looked pretty in the sketch, but it struck me as unnecessary, and forcibly charging every homeowner hundreds of dollars without a formal vote seemed overkill. Others voiced similar concerns. "I don't even want a bench on my property," said one older man. "I rarely sit outside." Another asked if we could opt out. Karen simply repeated, "It's a mandatory enhancement for the greater good." That phrase, "for the greater good," gave me chills. By the end of the meeting, the board concluded that the benches were a done deal. Karen insisted the timeline would be swift. Within a month, The stone benches would be installed at intervals along each street, funded by an immediate homeowner assessment. Anyone who refused to pay risked fines, then liens in the worst case. Harriet shot me a knowing glance, as if to say, "Welcome to life under Karen's reign." In the weeks following that meeting, a group of disgruntled residents attempted to protest. We circulated a petition requesting a formal vote before imposing the bench assessment. Harriet and I walked door to door, explaining that while decorative benches could be nice, forcing them on every property at a steep cost was unfair. Many people sympathized. We collected dozens of signatures in a matter of days. Karen, however, was unmoved. She posted a notice on the HOA's online forum, stating that the board's authority to fund improvements was spelled out in the bylaws. She claimed the small cost, roughly $350 per household, was justified by the aesthetic benefits and the potential for raising property values. When we requested an official hearing, Karen dismissed it as unnecessary duplication since the board had already deliberated. The other board members, either loyal to her or too timid to oppose her, went along with it. Some neighbors considered refusing to pay, but Karen's track record was intimidating. She'd threatened fines or even legal action before over lesser controversies. Harriet recounted how Karen once forced a family to remove a children's playset that didn't meet color standards. They eventually caved under the threat of mounting fines. "She's not bluffing," Harriet said with a weary shrug. "She'll do it." In the end, most people reluctantly paid the bench assessment, including me. As a new homeowner, I didn't want to be singled out or risk legal trouble. I consoled myself with the thought, maybe these benches wouldn't be so bad. Perhaps they'd add curb appeal or be occasionally useful. Little did I know that, ironically, they would become more than just idle decorations, but a small beacon of hospitality for people outside our pristine bubble. On a hot Tuesday morning, trucks arrived bearing slabs of carved stone. Over the next few days, workers dug shallow foundations in front of each property, anchoring the benches into the ground. Despite the lofty sketches, the actual benches were less refined. Heavy, grayish stone with decorative swirls that looked gaudier in real life than in Karen's stylized poster. They also took up more space on some narrow lawns than expected. More than a few neighbors groaned at the intrusion. I'll admit, the craftsmanship wasn't terrible, but it felt forced, particularly since many of us never wanted them. Harriet's bench ended up blocking part of her garden, overshadowing her carefully arranged flower bed. Another neighbor found the bench nearly up against her mailbox, making mail retrieval awkward. Complaints rolled into the HOA, but Karen dismissed them, claiming the placements were within guidelines and reminding folks that a uniform layout was key. Within a week, Summerview Estates was dotted with these large, identical stone benches every few houses, like strange sentinels. Some residents tried to decorate them with potted plants or small pillows, hoping to make them more personal. But that triggered new memos from Karen about maintaining uniformity. The result, a row of unadorned, impersonal stone seats that no one really used. It became an eyesore, our eyesore, forcibly paid for. The bitterness among neighbors was palpable. Harriet half-jokingly threatened to put a "for sale" sign on her bench. But we all felt cornered. We'd spent money, we were stuck with them, and Karen insisted we keep them exactly as they were. The more I looked at that bench on my lawn, the more I questioned what else Karen might force upon us if we let her. Then an idea began forming in my mind, an act of quiet rebellion that would use the benches in a way Karen never intended. A few days after the benches were installed, I was driving home from errands when I noticed a small group of individuals gathered near a strip mall parking lot, a couple miles outside Summerview Estates. They were holding signs that read, "Please help," and "Hungry." This wasn't unusual in many parts of the city. Homelessness was on the rise, and pockets of people in need often stood near commercial areas, hoping for spare change. I'd rarely ventured into direct involvement with homeless outreach, but that day something tugged at me. My mind flashed back to the newly erected benches in our pristine neighborhood. Benches that were going unused, ironically. The contrast was striking. We had these fancy stone seats we didn't want, while folks out here had nowhere comfortable to rest. The phrase, "for the greater good," that Karen had repeated rang hollow in my ears. Maybe, I thought, there was a way to repurpose those benches for actual benefit. I bought some sandwiches from a fast food joint, handed them out to a couple of the people by the strip mall, and chatted briefly. One man, Frank, told me how he lost his job, fell behind on rent, and ended up on the street. He was looking for day labor gigs, but struggled to find stable income. My heart clenched with sympathy. The memory of the brand new, mostly pointless bench on my lawn wouldn't leave me alone. If we had so much money to forcibly beautify, could we not also show a bit of hospitality to those lacking basic comforts? That night, Harriet and I discussed the possibility of inviting some of these folks to rest on our community benches. They're out there anyway, looking for a safe place to sit or sleep, I explained. Why not let them use these benches as a small reprieve? Harriet's eyes widened. She realized how much it would infuriate Karen. But she also saw the genuine compassion in the gesture. Karen will absolutely lose her mind, Harriet warned. I simply shrugged. She insisted on these benches for everyone's good. Let's see if she means it. I figured I'd need an organized approach if I truly wanted to invite homeless individuals into Summerview Estates. Randomly bringing strangers could cause panic among neighbors, especially if they felt blindsided. Instead, I reached out to a local nonprofit group, Open Arms Community Outreach, which specialized in assisting the homeless with meals, shelter referrals, and supportive programs. When I called and explained my notion, providing a safe place to rest or wait, even for a short time, one of their coordinators, Marcia, was intrigued. We're always looking for small pockets of welcoming spaces, she said. Are you sure your neighborhood will allow it? Some suburbs resist having homeless folks on their grounds. I hesitated. The HOA might not love it, but we have these brand new benches forced on us. The official stance is there for the community's benefit. I want to see if we can share them with those who truly need a seat. Maybe if a volunteer from your group accompanies them, or if we do at certain hours, it can minimize friction. Marcia paused thoughtfully. It's unconventional, but let's try. We can let folks know that your bench, maybe along with a few others, are available if they just need a short rest during the day or a place to sit while they figure out their next steps. I'll also ensure they know it's not overnight accommodation. A seat can still help, though. We agreed on a simple arrangement. Open Arms would mention to their clients that Summerview Estates had some open-air benches on the main street, in a quiet area, if they needed a midday break. The group would also coordinate volunteers to occasionally drop by with water or assist anyone who used the benches. Harriet half laughed, half cheered at the plan. I've never heard of a suburban bench share for the homeless, she said. But if it helps even a little and rubs Karen's nose in her own forced project, that's poetic justice. The next week, a few individuals from Open Arms ventured into Summerview Estates, their cautious faces reflecting the unfamiliar territory. A volunteer guided them to the benches along my stretch of the street, politely greeting me as they arrived. I offered some bottled water and light snacks. One older gentleman, wearing a worn jacket, sat down with a tired sigh, quietly thanking me for letting him rest his feet. Another person, a younger woman carrying a frayed backpack, expressed relief at having a safe spot to sit while she waited for a ride to a shelter. At first, a few neighbors passed by, casting curious glances. Some whispered to Harriet or me, uncertain but not hostile. Harriet explained that they were from a local charity, taking advantage of the benches for a short break. A handful of folks nodded, seemingly okay with it. Summerview Estates was typically quiet, so the presence of homeless guests was a novelty, but not an immediate crisis to most. Some neighbors even kindly brought out coffee or offered leftover pastries. But word inevitably reached Karen. She drove past that afternoon in her silver sedan, slowed to a crawl upon spotting strangers sitting on the newly installed bench, and stared with visible alarm. I stood by, arms folded calmly, meeting her gaze. She frowned deeply, quickly parking at the curb. Storming out, she approached me, her posture radiating indignation. "What is happening here?" she demanded, pointing to the visitors. "This neighborhood is private property. We can't just have vagrants using our benches." I kept my voice even. "These benches are on the right-of-way, near the sidewalk, presumably public enough for passers-by to rest. Weren't they meant to enhance the area for everyone? I'm simply offering them to folks who need a seat." Karen's cheeks flushed. "That's not the point of these benches. They're for Summerview residents, not outsiders. It's unsafe and unsightly." I raised an eyebrow. The project was funded by forced assessments from all of us. They're part of the neighborhood's welcoming aesthetic, right? Nothing in the HOA rules says it's restricted to residents only. The sidewalk is open to the public. You insisted these benches would show Summerview's commitment to beauty and community spirit. This is my interpretation of that spirit, helping people. She sputtered. We have a standard to uphold. This will lower property values. The board never intended them for homeless use. Her words turned heads. One of the visitors overheard, looking down, hurt flickering in their eyes. I quietly told Karen to be mindful, but she only glared. Furious, she stomped back to her car, presumably to plan her next move. Within days, Summerview Estates buzzed with rumors of outsiders coming to rest on the benches. Karen spread claims that dangerous homeless men were loitering, though we saw no evidence of danger. In truth, the visitors from Open Arms were polite, typically staying an hour or two before leaving. Some talked softly among themselves, grateful for a bit of shade and quiet. They neither harassed residents nor caused visible trouble. Still, a few neighbors, fearful or heavily influenced by Karen, voiced concern. Is it safe? Are we sure they're not trespassing on private property? Harriet tried to reassure them, explaining the sidewalk and roadside portion belonged to the city easement, meaning passers-by had the right to be there. The benches themselves, ironically, had been placed at the behest of the HOA, not the homeowners. So they existed in a gray zone, partly on public right-of-way, partly on private land. But either way, not even Karen had a clear path to ban certain people from using them, unless she wanted to undermine her own community enhancement justification. Karen, nonetheless, ramped up the pressure. She fired off an official HOA email claiming residents were reporting suspicious behavior near the benches, and that Summerview might need new guidelines to restrict loitering. She singled out my address, accusing me of inviting unwanted individuals. She threatened fines for misuse of communal property, a threat that sounded hollow, given that she had championed these benches as an open community feature. I responded calmly, forwarding her emails to the entire board, pointing out that loitering guidelines would also apply to any Summerview resident who sat for extended periods. That would make no sense. Ms. Delgado, one of the more moderate board members, privately told me she suspected Karen was panicking, realizing she'd inadvertently created a perfect scenario for my charitable gesture. Delgado also assured me the board had no official policy to ban homeless people from resting on the benches. It would look terrible for our public image, she said. Thus, a stalemate formed. Karen wanted the benches used exclusively by Summerview's respectable residents, but had zero legal grounds to enforce that. The benches were installed and funded by a forced assessment on the premise of community improvement. Now, any attempt to remove them or limit usage would ironically open the HOA to potential lawsuits. And so Karen stewed, powerless to block the homeless visitors from quietly enjoying a seat. Desperate, Karen tried a new angle, removing or relocating the benches altogether. She whispered to some supporters about excessive costs of upkeep, hoping to push a second special vote to dismantle them. But this was met with outrage from residents who had already paid the initial assessment. You forced us to pay hundreds of dollars, and now you want them gone, Harriet exclaimed. Others demanded a refund if the benches vanished. The fiasco was partly comedic. Karen had created a problem that no one but her wanted to solve. A heated board meeting ensued. Karen proposed a motion. Since the benches are being misused, we should withdraw them or store them until a better usage policy is set. She spoke grandly of preserving Summerview's image, claiming the presence of homeless individuals was damaging property values. A few nervous neighbors backed her, but the majority either remained neutral or rolled their eyes. Ms. Delgado pointed out the entire community had been taxed for them, so removing them would require reimbursing every household. The HOA treasury didn't have that money readily available. When the vote came, Karen's motion failed 3-2. She and one staunch ally lost to Ms. Delgado, the board president, and another member who recognized the fiasco removing them would cause. Furious but trapped by her own logic, Karen watched her precious benches remain in place. Summerview Estates was stuck with them, and with my philanthropic usage of them. Meanwhile, Harriet, quietly thrilled by the situation, suggested we inform local media about our community benches turned homeless respite. She argued it might rally more charitable support or push Summerview to address the issue of forced aesthetic projects. I hesitated at first, not wanting sensational coverage. But Harriet assured me it could highlight a positive message, bridging the gap between suburban comfort and those in need. We reached out to a local reporter who covered community stories. She visited, snapped photos of the benches, and interviewed me about how I'd partnered with Open Arms to let homeless folks rest there. The resulting article's headline read something like, "When HOA Bench Mandates Meet Human Kindness." It portrayed Summerview Estates as a microcosm of suburban friction, a forced beautification project ironically serving a genuine humanitarian purpose. The piece included quotes from Harriet, who called the arrangement a silver lining to an otherwise pointless expense. They also tried reaching Karen for comment, but she declined to speak, presumably fuming at the coverage. The story circulated on social media, drawing mixed reactions. Some lauded the gesture, praising Summerview's inadvertent benevolence. Others worried about importing homelessness into quiet neighborhoods. Still, the positive voices prevailed. Even certain Summerview residents softened, seeing that the visitors from Open Arms were not troublemakers, just people in need of rest. Karen, though, bristled under the spotlight. Harriet overheard her complaining that the unsightly media coverage would tarnish Summerview's prestige. She threatened to file a defamation claim, but with no real legal basis. Tensions soared, but I refused to back down. As far as I was concerned, the benches existed for community benefit, and that included those beyond our gates who might need a seat. With media attention swirling, Karen attempted smaller tactics to deter the homeless visitors. She posted signs on certain benches reading, "For Summerview residents only," scrawling phrases like, "ID may be required." Immediately, Ms. Delgado removed them, noting no official board vote had authorized such signage. Karen also tried instructing landscaping crews to water the lawns during midday, hoping to soak the benches and deter usage. That backfired when neighbors complained about random midday water saturating the sidewalks. Frustrated, Karen then circulated new rumors that petty theft was on the rise near the benches. She had no evidence, but implied that strangers were rummaging through mailboxes or walking around suspiciously. Harriet fact-checked these claims with local police, who reported zero theft spike. If anything, Summerview's crime rate was minimal. Police saw no reason to suspect the homeless visitors were behind any wrongdoing. In each case, Karen's moves were stymied by either the board or practical reality. The forced bench project had ironically bound her. She couldn't remove them without undermining the costly initiative she championed. She couldn't legally ban non-residents from sitting in a publicly accessible area. She tried social pressure, but I remained calm, continuing to partner with Open Arms. A few neighbors who'd originally disliked the bench idea even began dropping by to bring bottled water or fruit for the guests. The small kindness blossomed. Even Harriet set out potted flowers near her bench, ignoring Karen's demands for uniform design. Summerview's ambience was changing. Once stifled by rigid rules, it grew more neighborly, ironically due to these stone benches that Karen had forced upon us. One poignant day, Harriet and I witnessed an encounter that exemplified the new atmosphere. A neighbor, Mr. Paget, a retired gentleman known for his meticulous lawn, approached the bench outside his house where two homeless visitors were resting. We braced for confrontation, but instead, Mr. Paget offered them cold lemonade. Soon, they were chatting amicably, Mr. Paget learning about their backgrounds, sharing bits of his own life story. The scene was nearly surreal. A stoic retiree genuinely connecting with individuals he might have once crossed the street to avoid. That same day, Karen drove by, slowed down upon seeing this friendly scene, then accelerated away, presumably enraged. Harriet smirked. She wanted benches to showcase Summerview's unity. Now it's unifying folks from all walks of life. She can't stomach it. The new bridging between Summerview residents and the homeless visitors wasn't universal. Some remained uncomfortable or standoffish. But a shift was undeniable. A local pastor who lived in the neighborhood began bringing small care packages, socks, toothpaste, to share if visitors arrived. Another neighbor posted a note, "If you need a drink or snack, knock on my door." Karen's forced project had, ironically, kindled a philanthropic spark many never knew was possible here. Open Arms volunteers popped by weekly, ensuring no loitering beyond a few hours, No trash left behind. No hassle for residents. The arrangement was working smoothly. Harriet joked that if Karen forced any more expensive enhancements, we'd turn them into more charitable resources. Sensing she was losing grip, Karen demanded an emergency HOA session. The official notice read, Agenda, addressing non-resident usage of benches and potential liability issues. Harriet and I braced for a final showdown. The community center filled with tension again. Karen opened the session by citing hypothetical dangers, liability if someone was injured on the benches, potential lawsuits, property value decline. She brandished a handful of printouts describing neighborhoods that regulated vagrants. However, the tide had turned. Residents recounted positive experiences, how the visitors were polite, rarely staying long, and how some neighbors actually enjoyed offering help. Ms. Delgado pointed out the benches were on partial city easement, so restricting them was legally tricky. Another board member argued that forcibly removing them or gating them off would undermine the entire rationale for the assessment. And a few neighbors simply declared they found joy in providing a small comfort to people who needed it. Karen's arguments grew more desperate. We can't let Summerview become a magnet for the homeless, she cried. This was never the intent. We are respectable families here. Her words rang hollow. More than a few residents glared at her, offended by the blatant classism. Harriet publicly retorted that true respectability includes compassion, not gatekeeping. Applause broke out. When the board voted on whether to impose new restrictions or remove the benches, Karen's motion failed again. This time resoundingly, 4-1. No special rules were adopted. Summerview's official stance. The benches remain open for lawful public use, visitors included. Furious, Karen stormed out before the session ended, leaving behind a silent room. In the following weeks, Summerview Estates settled into a strange equilibrium. Karen, humiliated by multiple board defeats, scaled back her public hostility. She still patrolled the neighborhood, scowling whenever she saw an unfamiliar face on a bench, but no further official letters threatened us. The board had made it clear they wouldn't support removing or restricting the benches. Harriet said Karen might be biding her time until a new election cycle, but for now, she was checkmated. The homeless visitors continued to drop by occasionally. Never a flood, typically just 2 or 3 individuals in a day. Some left behind heartfelt thank you notes. One man, who found a job and got off the street, returned just to say thanks for providing him a calm place to rest while he was searching for work. Harriet was moved to tears. Tanya, the neighbor who once battled Karen about minor yard details, told me how proud she was that Summerview ended up showing more heart than anyone expected. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. A handful of residents quietly complained about having riffraff in the neighborhood, but they refrained from pushing the matter further, given the board's stance. Sometimes I'd overhear grumbles about resellers rummaging in recycling bins, but those turned out to be unrelated incidents, and we had no real evidence to blame the bench visitors. The social dynamic was complex, but the wave of fear Karen tried to stoke never materialized into reality. As the months passed, it became normal to see an occasional homeless person or two sitting on one of the decorative benches, sipping water or chatting with an open-arms volunteer. Summerview streets remained as tidy and tranquil as ever. No spike in crime, no plummeting property values, no chaos that Karen had predicted. In truth, the benches had found a purpose beyond mere ornamentation or forced aesthetic. They became a subtle symbol of compassion. Karen, for her part, retreated into an echo chamber of her own outrage. She'd occasionally mutter about property values or threaten to run for board president again to clean up the neighborhood. But the fiasco over the benches had tarnished her credibility, and many neighbors saw her more as an overbearing figure than a protector of Summerview's refined image. Harriet told me some older residents even joked, Karen's benches are now public rest stops. How's that for refinement? Even the local media cooled on the story after the initial splash. The forced bench project turned beneficial was a novelty, but once it became routine, it didn't generate fresh headlines. For me, that was a relief. I never wanted Summerview to be a spectacle, just a place where we could quietly demonstrate that forced aesthetics could become a platform for genuine kindness. Time marched on. Summerview Estates experienced the usual suburban rhythms, holiday decoration squabbles, landscaping updates, board elections. I lived my life peacefully, paying my HOA dues, mowing my lawn, and occasionally greeting the new individuals who found a brief oasis on the bench outside my home. Harriet continued her watchful presence next door, now convinced that one determined homeowner could shift the entire neighborhood's dynamic. As for Karen, Beatrice Arnett, her crusade against the benches never truly ended in her mind, but she had no official means to remove them. The board's repeated refusals to enact her crackdown left her with little more than complaints and disapproving stares. She'd pass by, see a guest resting on the bench, and drive on, powerless. The benches she'd once touted as a crowning achievement of Summerview's unity had become exactly that, but not in the way she intended. Open Arms kept referencing Summerview's benches in their outreach materials, not as a formal shelter, but as an example that compassion can emerge from unexpected places. They reminded folks that real solutions to homelessness require broader policies, but small kindnesses, like a place to sit, mattered too. Meanwhile, I kept a box of bottled water in my garage, occasionally handing them out to visitors. Harriet did the same. I never forgot the irony. Karen forced each household to pay for these heavy, ornate benches in the name of community enhancement. We complied, begrudgingly. Then, I redefined enhancement to mean inclusivity for those typically shut out of fancy suburban enclaves. People in need found a sliver of rest in a place that once prided itself on exclusivity. For me, that was the sweetest victory, turning a top-down, oppressive directive into something that bridged divides. Now, when I sit on my bench, sipping coffee on a quiet morning, I sometimes reflect on how one person's arrogance ironically birthed an opportunity for good. Karen's benches may have begun as a forced aesthetic imposition, but they ended up as a subtle symbol that even within the strict confines of an HOA-ruled suburb, genuine empathy can flourish. We offered a seat to the weary, no matter how Karen seethed, and in doing so, we found a bit of humanity behind the stone veneer of Summerview Estates.